Hey friends, it's me Joey and welcome back to my channel Gender Not Found. So today I'm gonna be reading a friend's one shot of Monica and Chandler, which I love. It's a couple I love. Like I looked up Friends fan fiction and I went to, the fan fiction site fanfiction.net and this is the first one that came up. One shot of it's a one shot of Monica and Chandler basically. Disclaimer, I don't own the characters of the apartment, just the DVDs. There's no profit except writing practice being made here. Uh, it's called Ishq? 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 I don't know. ISHQ. Someone please tell me how to pronounce that because I don't friggin' know. Anyway, it means when you're in the honeymoon phase of love and are feeling a passionate love for your partner. The feeling you have when the initial love you felt for someone has now taken root. The origin of this word comes from the Arabic word for vine, conveying the impression of the love having been planted in your heart so it can grow into an eternal passion. Interesting. Monica hadn't been sure if she wanted Chandler over tonight, but now that the clock was ticking past 11, she could feel herself growing frustrated that he hadn't shown up. Was this his way of telling her he'd lost interest in her? Surely not. Only a few days ago he'd told her his definition of being with her meant spending more time together. Maybe she'd been off-putting when she snapped at him the other day, but she was normally fairly bossy and controlling, and she'd only been a little bit moodier than she typically was, and most of that had to do with sleep deprivation caused by him and the oncoming time of the month. But avoiding her because of that? Chandler Bing had always been the only person who never treated her any differently, as when she was taking charge, as opposed to when she was being laid back. The only person who actually liked her when she was being bossy and controlling. At least, that's what Monica had perceived him, rolling his eyes with a smile at her, ordering them to use coasters while the rest of them left the room as. He had never avoided her before. Why would he start doing that now? What did that mean? Monica rolled across her mattress onto the other pillow. It wasn't like they'd exhausted the playbook or fallen into tired patterns of having boring or lazy making love. Every time her best friend looked at her, Monica's skin grew hot. Never mind how he moved her hands languidly across her, his tongue marking every inch of her skin, letting his breath caress her moist, sensitive spots. Monica couldn't have shivered more if she was skinny dipping in winter, and that was just the foreplay. Never mind that the push and pull of their bodies seemed to work in tandem without any conscious effort, or that she could grind herself down on him until he pressed those nerve endings within her, or that Chandler could look at her or touch a tender hand to her cheek, all the while violently slamming their bodies together, building up the pleasure within her like a wall between her physical body and her emotional mind, and then tear it down with a curse and a growl, the dam flooding and her psyche finally feeling complete. Maybe it came too easy to him, being with her. There was no challenge, no chase, except for dodging their friends and making up believable excuses, while the actual act came so naturally to them. Maybe he didn't feel that exceptionally profound magic between them. Maybe being with her didn't feel like his missing pieces slotting into place, like being with him felt to her. Perhaps Chandler was done with her now that they'd answered the question of what sex would be like between them. But Monica wasn't. Monica certainly hadn't grown tired of Chandler in any sense of the word. Every minute with him she discovered something new. She'd been spending not only a lot of time with him, but a lot of time with him, matching his actions. She had also known him to be observant and quiet, reserved to say just the right thing at the right time to benefit someone the most, whether it was a joke or advice. But she'd been staying quiet and observing the group with him from as close as she dared in the corner of the couch, and Monica was only just realizing how much thought and effort went into those quips. Plus, she'd also been spending a lot of time with him, learning new ticklish spots and how to tug the soft hair at the back of his head, right down at the nape of his neck, her hand hidden by her long sleeve so that he would groan lowly. She craved him more now than she had that night in London. She needed to sit across from him and feel her body coil in annoyance that he was so far away, her insides tightening and contracting, every muscle constricting, until she could see his whispered words, and ghostly touch to soothe her tension and wind her tighter until she couldn't take it any more, and then was released like a top, spinning dizzily through the universe for a brief euphoric moment before she settled into the reality of his arms. That was enough, Monica decided. Her body was a tight coil, a viper ready to strike, and Chandler was who she wanted to bite, although she wasn't sold on if she wanted sex or an explanation first. As she got up, Monica winced at the ache in her abdomen. It was a twisting, pulsing pain, dull and sharp, and right beneath her navel, and Monica recalled why she'd curled up in bed earlier than usual. Making love wasn't really an option tonight, she knew, so she'd settle for yelling at him, wondering why he'd stood her up, having the conversation they needed to have. Still, she soldiered on, pulling a robe around her body despite her pajamas, and checked the coast was clear of Rachel first, then later of Joey. Monica tiptoed to Chandler's bedroom door. He'd glued it back together when they'd started their trysts, something about the bottom half not being secure enough to keep their secret, and oiled the hinges so it didn't squeak as she pushed it open. His room was dark, almost pitch black, save for a sliver of moonlight from the window, bathing the gray sheets in silver moonlight. She could see Chandler in the middle of the bed, lying on his side with his face towards her. He was sleeping. The covers were pulled up to his chest, but his bare arms were folded over the top of them, tucked beneath his head. His skin was pale in the half light, his lashes casting long shadows over his high cheekbones. He was lovely looking. He was lovely looking, peaceful. A plump bottom lip poked at the back of his hand, soft breathing sounding under Joey's distant snores. Monica hesitated. Chandler had been exhausted as of late, in no small part because of her, and Monica wondered if she should let him sleep, unbothered. He'd always been soft and innocent, but was more so in slumber. No worry or spite on his features, no self-deprecating jokes on his lips. Then again, with the energy they expended, the scant hours they caught of sleep were actually very restful. Plus, she knew how nice it was to have his deep inhales at her back, his breath washing over her hair as he nuzzled his nose into the back of her neck, his strong arms wrapped around her. She wanted to curl up into the fetal position, favoring her abdomen but letting Chandler's toned thighs curl behind her. She wanted to hitch her leg over the top of his hip and squeeze his back to her chest, be the one holding him for once, letting him feel safe and protected and relaxed, the way he made her feel, his breath sinking to hers. Monica pressed her lips together. They weren't there. That wasn't what their relationship involved. They fell asleep together after making love, her head on his sweaty chest, and they fell asleep in their own beds after a few rounds of undulating against each other so that they didn't get caught by their friends. But they didn't seek each other out solely to sleep. No metaphor or innuendo. Together. The alarm on his bedside table buzzed once. Monica nearly jumped out of her skin and smacked the plastic rectangle to stop it from waking everybody up. From waking anybody up. Just gotta plug my computer in. Then she realized what that alarm meant. Chandler waking up to come across the hall, and Monica cursed herself for freaking out that he hadn't come around at 11 on the dot like he had the past few nights. In fact, she remembered him saying something about Joey working late or having a date, and a half-hour delay didn't seem so outrageous anymore. And then she realized she'd stopped it from waking him. Should she wake Chandler? Monica wondered. He hadn't been really getting much sleep. He hadn't complained about it, but there were dark circles under his eyes, and while he joked about falling asleep at his desk at work, Monica knew he put in an almost equal amount of effort into working hard at his job, as he pretended he didn't. Besides, she wasn't going to lie naked with him or let him touch her more than that. Not when her period had started this morning, and she'd already organized herself with a nighttime pad and black tights. Monica had never made love on her period before, and while the idea intrigued her, and she was certainly horny enough to try it, she wasn't about to start now. Not when she didn't know how long this thing between them would last. What would happen if she lay with him, just resting in his arms? Would he wake up and freak out that they had crossed a line from making great love to spending time together and then to something more? Would he even see it as something more? Or would he snuggle into her, wake up briefly and whisper something that made her smile, like he always did as he was falling asleep, and then freak out when they hadn't set an alarm for the morning and almost got caught? Pausing to think about it, Monica realized Chandler was probably far more likely to do the latter, but she didn't want to risk any negative repercussions, not when she was enjoying his company so much. She shut the door behind her and then turned back to the bed and shook Chandler's arm. He didn't even stir. She jostled him again, nailing one leg onto the bed so she could be more forceful. Nothing. She didn't want to say anything, just in case she was too loud and woke Joey, whose snoring had horrifyingly quietened, quietened as though he might be bordering on wakefulness. Monica snatched a pillow from beside Chandler's head and whacked him with it. Hey, what? He flustered awake, blinking confused, and swatting the pillow away before his eyes met hers and his body relaxed, lifting up on one elbow to look at her. Hi. Hi. Monica put the pillow back down and knelt fully on the bed. Chandler pressed up from his elbow to his hand and pressed his lips to hers softly in greeting. Monica blinked at how quick his kiss was. She was used to long drawn-out kisses that left her breathless and wondering how much time had actually passed, whether or not it had been him or her that had unhooked her bra, and if they ever planned on actually leaving each other, because this goodbye was getting heated. Again. I didn't think you were coming over, so I thought I'd make the trek, she whispered, hoping that didn't sound as desperate as she thought it did. I wasn't, he said, bending his knees towards him and sitting up straight. Monica squeezed her eyes closed. Oh, okay. She pressed her hands on the mattress so she could unfold her legs from beneath her and step backwards off his bed. Isn't it? Don't. He caught her wrist, then let out a breath. I mean, I was going to sneak across and kiss you good night. I've got chocolate in the fridge I was going to take with me, but I wasn't going to stay. Monica relinquished herself to her curiosity, dropping to her lean on her hip, her folded knees at her sides, her feet by his pillow, as her body mirrored Chandler's but in the opposite direction. I mean, aren't you? You know. Aren't you? That time? Anyone ever told you you're cute when you're flustered? She grinned. She really quite liked the way his cheeks rounded with a self-conscious smile. Chandler's hands flapped as he tried to recover. He was so different when he was being intimate with her, confident and sure, his hands steady when he touched her. It made her wonder how much it was an act to fit in with the rest of them, to ease them into a conversation if he appeared more bubbling than he really was. Or maybe he really was that shy and unsure. Because whatever it was between them that felt like a lasso yanking them together made her more confident too, like it anchored her to a reality she had never known, or was the key to a previously locked aspect of herself. His hand covered hers atop her knee. His hand was warm and sent shivers down her spine. Yeah, she answered his question, with all the new facets of their relationship, the discussions about how on earth love could be so electric between them, and lying to their friends and drinking champagne instead of beer together. She'd forgotten how well he knew her in other ways, that she'd been one of the people he'd observed for years, learning her tricks and quirks and cycles. I am. I figured you wouldn't want me bothering you, Chandler shrugged. Monica blushed at the exceedingly sweet man looking at her and his unending sensitivity. She smirked. They'd been using a lot of euphemisms to hide what they'd been doing, and it has turned her mind filthy, detecting secret, probably unintended messages in everything he said. I like it when you bother me. That made him chuckle loudly, the sound rumbling deliciously in his chest, reverberating in the air between them. I like bothering you. You really are very good at it, she grinned, leaning in for another kiss. Her hands pushed against his arms, his forearms rippling beneath her touch as he changed his grip to hold her hips. His fingers tapped against her thighs, working underneath her robe and finding the sliver of exposed skin between her waistband and her singlet. Monica picked her lips against Chandler's smile and gripped his biceps harshly when his tongue caressed against the seam of her lips. She pulled away from him, using her hold on his arms to allow her to lean as far back as her spine would let her. Do you really have chocolate in the fridge for me? If Joe hasn't eaten it, he grinned back. And if he had? Chandler bent his head and stroked his fingers up and down the dip of her wrist. Then I would have just stopped by to say hi. Maybe just lie next to you if you wanted me to. I wasn't expecting much this week. Certainly not this. What's the plan? Monica could have swooned at the low, sincere way he told her he had low expectations, and the wonder that twinkled in his eyes when he looked at her. Since when do we have a plan? He laughed, a short breath through his nose. Monica trailed her hands up his arms and over Chandler's shoulders, hooking her hands together behind his neck as she leaned closer. His right hand came up to stroke over the shell of her ear and press a sweet kiss to her lips. Let's lie down. Get some well-deserved rest while we can. You look like you need it. Monica puckered her lips as Chandler pulled his away from her, not letting him move away from her completely and capturing his lips with her own for another soft kiss. I think I need something else first. She didn't want to make love. She definitely wasn't ready for that. Wasn't sure if she'd ever want to let a man be with her intimately while she was on her period, but she didn't want him to give her space either. Oh yeah? His thumb stroked over her cheekbone, and then his lips came to finally, blessedly, touch against hers, warm and already open. Monica let Chandler's lips coax hers open, her hands winding into his hair to pull him closer. His hair was so soft between her fingers, their lips molded together, pushing against each other until she scratched her nails against Chandler's scalp and he groaned. Monica sucked his plump bottom lip into her mouth, feeling him do the same with her top lip. Monica's eyes, already closed, fluttered as Chandler took a long pull of her flesh. She copied him, hoping his abdomen would quiver like hers did. His nose pressed into her cheek as Chandler tilted his head, and Monica nipped at his lip, while her fingernails scraped down the back of his neck. Chandler shuddered beneath her touch, his legs shifting against the sheets. His hand fisted in her hair and tenderly gripped the back of her neck. Meanwhile, his fingers burned a line from her waist to her spine, but instead of flattening his palm against her back, like Monica expected him to, Chandler continued in the same direction to paint a line of his fingerprint to the opposite side of her body, pulling her impossibly close. Chandler flicked his tongue across her lip again, and Monica licked where she'd been biting him before she opened her mouth to accept his intrusion. He was fantastic at this part, building her anticipation so slowly that Monica was the one whining for him to continue. Chandler kissed her softly, promisingly, his tongue just touching the roof of her mouth, teasing behind her teeth. Monica brushed her hands back into his hair as Chandler let go of hers. His fingers tangled into the collar of her robe, one hand working upwards, the other down, where he tugged her closer by the clothing. The tip of his tongue pressed against hers gently, drawing odd, zigzagging swirls inside her mouth. Monica let out a shaky breath through her nose and wrapped her lips around him, sucking him deeper into her as Chandler's hands flickered up to her shoulders. He seemed to move so easily, sliding his hands into the tops of her sleeves, vaguely calloused palms smoothing over her bare shoulders. She shivered at his touch and the fondness of it, her chest tingling at the tender way his hands never left her skin as she removed her robe. From that first night in London, Chandler had been heartbreakingly gentle with her, passionate and rough and shameless as he moved, letting her take over happily, manipulating her body with a bruising grip, but able to turn on a dime and run a single finger over her lip, navy eyes beckoning her closer, making her shiver with need for him renewed, as sexy as he was slow. It was that tenderness, that whisper of sincerity that Monica had never had with a man before. Not really. Kip was seeing someone else. Fun Bobby only wanted to make love. Richard was amid a midlife crisis, and she looked like his wife. Pete needed to bolster his public image. From all of those men, Monica had contorted herself into a shape to fit their expectations and fantasies. From all of them, she'd hidden her true nature, her desire to control things, and her need to be simply controlled, and her need to be similarly controlled, giving up her autonomy, but by not communicating what she really wanted. Chandler already knew, and what he didn't, he asked and enacted with fervor, and in the quiet of catching their breath between rounds, he'd gotten out of bed and folded his pajamas and laid them beside her dress, knowing that it bothered her, even though she hadn't dared say anything in case it ruined the mood. It was the way he stopped to tilt her chin so their eyes would meet and would check that this was what she wanted, even though they'd been wrapped around each other only moments before, and his gasping breaths when he looked at her, his soft fingers unfurling her, easing the knots of anxiety and pressure to live up to his expectations with a simple smile, laying her out, bare to him in every sense, with genuine surprise and awe sculpting his features in the harsh light of the hotel room, awe that she had allowed him to see all of herself. No one had ever looked at her that way, or taken that much care, getting to know her, every nook and cranny. That didn't stop once he'd memorized every inch of her skin. Chandler massaged his lips against hers once, twice, and then kissed the corner of her lip, her cheek, her jaw. He trailed his mouth across her skin to lick a circle just beneath her ear, and then he pulled away, licking his lips and pulling a disgusted face. "Is that a new perfume?" he asked, his mouth opening wide and his tongue wagging like the taste was offensive. Anybody else in Monica would have been self-conscious about it, but Chandler's hands dropped down to hers, fishing them out of her sleeves and then tangling their fingers together. Rachel's, she told him, half laughing at him, half because of him. She'd never laughed during making love before. She didn't realize it was a thing, but with Chandler, it was the norm for him to say something to diffuse the tension that was building between them. The second someone walked into the apartment, or in the cold, sweat-slicked moments between then, he would say something inappropriate or challenging to get her to roll on top of him, shake her hair over her shoulder, and bend down to kiss him and prove him wrong. Too strong? Too something. He opened his mouth in a wide circle and flicked his tongue in disgust. His fingers played with hers, rolling her wrists with their hands clasped together, and then toying dizzyingly up her bare arms. She spritzed me with it this morning, Monica explained, tracing her fingers over the hem of his t-shirt at his collar, up and around his neck, trying to make Chandler shiver the way he made her. Her fingertips brushed along his skin to rest in the divot between his collarbones, just nudging at the bulge of his Adam's apple. She could feel the steady pulse of his heartbeat beneath her fingers, concrete and grounding. It didn't matter how Rachel had bothered her that morning or that she'd briefly worried he had stood her up. All that mattered was the reality of his clothes barricading her view of his trim chest. Monica tried not to roll her eyes as she explained what her roommate had done, knowing Chandler wasn't going to let her avoid voicing her annoyance now that she'd started. Apparently I need to go on a date before I forget how it all works. Wherever you want to go, we'll go. Monica blinked, an unsure smile splitting her face to make way for her giddiness to bubble out of her. Okay. Was it really that easy? It had never been that easy to move forward before. Then again, everything else with Chandler was. Becoming his friend was simple. Learning she could open up to him without being judged had been an accident, and trusting him came naturally. Jumping off the tightrope of their friendship, and not knowing whether landing in a sexual relationship would be like landing on concrete or being caught in and cradled by a net had been effortless. Of course, it would be just as easy to take the next step with him. Monica tried to temper her smile by leaning in to kiss him. Her hand stroked down Chandler's covered chest as she sucked at his mouth, coaxing his tongue against hers. He chuckled lowly as he pressed into her, curling his tongue around hers, the muscle flicking softly over the sensitive edge of her lips as it moved. Monica fit her palms over the shape of his chest, kneading his skin in a reflection of the way he squeezed her shoulders with the heels of his hands. He dropped his fingers so that the back of his knuckles kisses down her upper arm, and then traced deliciously over the curve of her breasts. He flattened his tongue against hers, tracing the inside of her mouth and taking gentle tugs of that may as well have been the breath from her lungs as he pushed and suckled her mouth. His thumbs pressed into the soft skin of her abdomen between her hip bones, and Monica groaned aloud, her head falling backwards. He'd applied just enough pressure that any pulsing period pains had diffused beneath his touch, his thumbs pressing upwards toward her navel like he already knew just how to massage her aches away. She felt her insides convulse pleasantly, contracting and tightening and disappointingly empty, realizing Chandler hadn't been miraculously attuned to what kind of care she needed during her menstrual cycle, having observed her press a hushed palm to her belly, but was instead satisfying his own need to leave his fingerprint on her bare skin and kissing his thumbs where his lips typically fell when she wasn't sure how far she would let him go. He paused, but not long enough for Monica to lift her head back up and question the delay. Then Chandler rose to his knees while still gripping her body tightly. Monica loved when he used his height against her like this. No other man she had ever known used his height in the way Chandler did. Everything else shrunk down to meet her. Everyone else shrunk down to meet her. They knew they were tall and made it known, whether he looked down his nose, hunching over patronizingly, crouching as though she was a child, or wrapping large arms around her, fully aware his height made her feel small and petite and womanly, but weak too. Weak at the knees, but also in a horribly powerless sort of way, like he was too large for her to have any control. Not Chandler. Chandler was very good at sitting so they were eye level, hopping down a step goofily so he stood lower than her on the landing. He took steps backwards so they could look at each other squarely, and he did it so well that Monica forgot about their height difference on most days. But sometimes, and they were always so instinctive, he would make his height known to her, kneeling above her like this, resting his chin on her hand while he held her. Chandler rose up to her, straightening his spine from a slump or slouch, proud and confident. The angle was sharp when he touched his nose to hers. Monica's head tilted almost all the way back, so she could look into his hooded eyes. He beamed, and Monica mirrored his smile. Chandler stroked his nose against hers, making her skin tingle with the chasteness of his touch. Meanwhile, his warm hands slipped beneath her tight singlet and spanned her waist. Monica groaned as her chest stretched, and Chandler finally dipped forward, pecking her lips once. The pair of them hummed happily as Chandler used his height to hover just above her, predatory and playful, pushing her slowly backwards onto the mattress. Monica lay down with her head at the foot of the bed, Chandler lying on his side and draping his body over hers carefully, barely touching her. Finally, his lips descended over hers. Their smiles crashed together briefly, lips incapable of properly touching before things turned serious, and Monica inhaled deeply to dispel her grin. Her hands tangled in the back of Chandler's hair, pulling his mouth to hers fiercely. When Monica opened her mouth to him, he groaned deliciously, sliding his tongue against hers. He settled with his left leg between hers, his knee hitched, just a whisper of pressure between her thighs, and Monica squeezed her legs, needing more, needing him more. Understanding what Monica was trying to tell him, Chandler slipped his knee from between her legs, shuffling downwards so his thigh was captured by hers, and his chest was flush against her. His hands brushed up her torso, sliding around her body to cup her upper back and pull them together tightly. All the while his tongue stroked the roof of her mouth languidly. Monica couldn't remember the last time she'd made out with a man. Certainly exchanging kisses, but never without intending to take things further. But she was sure that this was not what was happening. She could feel Chandler's fingertips on her shoulders, and the slight pressure of his palms just beneath them, as he pulled her up to meet him. His mouth was hot against hers, soft and gentle, and Monica's eyes rolled back behind her eyelids because of the simplicity of it, as she let him control the moment. Chandler pulled away slightly to breathe deeply through his nose, sending the feather-light flutters through her body and up her neck as he took her top lip in between his teeth and tugged. Chandler seemed quite content to kiss her delicately, rubbing his lips against hers and slipping from her mouth in little, gentle kisses against one lip at a time. Her insides pulsed promisingly, and Monica opened her mouth under Chandler's, hoping he'd kiss her more harshly. He didn't. Instead, Chandler rimmed her lips with the tip of his tongue, tickling the inside of her cheek on his way to the back of her mouth. She moaned, her whole body pitching upwards as he drew lazy circles inside her. Monica could barely breathe. He'd embraced her so completely, but she didn't care. She got just enough oxygen through her nose between moans, and she wasn't about to push him away from her when he had just started to rock against her like that. Monica reached her hands downward, slipping her fingers into the back of Chandler's shirt to clutch at his skin. She slid her tongue along the length of his, laving against it briefly. Monica had every intention of shoving her tongue into the back of his throat, invading his senses the way he had invaded hers. But it was quite nice, relaxing, soothing, just massaging him with her mouth. Nothing more than connecting his hard body to her soft one. Their tongues danced gently, rolling and twining, dipping and teasing, coaxing hushed moans out of each other. Monica didn't think she would, but she thrilled that Chandler's kisses didn't grow more heated. In fact, the soft sucking pressure and sweet taste of his toothpaste sent shivers through her body just the same. It was a heady experience, having his chest crushed to hers, but his kiss barely above an exhale against her lips. Monica ran her tongue through the line of Chandler's teeth, pulling away from him to suck his plump bottom lip into her mouth. Her hands tangled back into his hair, and Chandler leaned backwards to touch his forehead to hers and grin, the two of them catching their breath in the darkness. His hair was painted silver in the moonlight from the window, his face a gorgeous silhouette as he smiled down at her. He had always been handsome and had a great tight-lipped smile, but hovering over her, grinning with his teeth showing, Chandler was gorgeous. Blood pumped thickly through her body, her insides pulsing with desire at the sight of him. Monica had always thought Chandler was good-looking, exceptionally handsome when she'd first met him, and doubly so at Ross's first wedding, when his hair had been all long and soft-looking, but he'd sort of faded into the background of the men in her life over the years. Muscle and mustaches coming into popularity until Monica realized she hadn't actually been attracted to those attributes. She wanted to tell him she'd never found him more attractive than he had been over the past year, since he'd finally started fitting into his clothes again after Janice stole his confidence, and her betrayal and his workload. She had stolen his appetite, but that the blonde in his hair from time in the sun had worked wonders with his blue eyes, but really what she wanted to compliment was the strength he'd been hiding in his chest and arms underneath those baggy sweatshirts and blazers. As his friend, she probably would have said something offhand at the dinner table, or maybe if they went to the beach, but Monica wasn't sure what the etiquette was now that they were whatever they were doing together. Would it be weird if she said he was hot? Certainly, when he said it to her, it felt like all her self doubt melted away. But could she return the favor? Or would it feel like she was reverting back to just making offhand comments, or worse, trying to get him into bed with salacious but trite comments? She didn't want that, even if she did want his shirt off. So instead, Monica showed him. After all, that was all she was really doing these days, the only real change to their relationship. She could run her hands through his hair appreciatively and hum when he hugged her for just a second too long, even though he knew she'd made up the story about Linda from camp. She could moan when she felt his body collide with hers and be physically vulnerable with him now, and Monica was loving every second of it. She kissed him, hard, and his nose dug into her cheekbone with the force of a kiss. Their mouths melded, her whole body melting despite the electricity that thrummed through her. She could feel him harden against her hip bone and chuckled that he was so obviously wanting more, but kissing him languidly to disguise his desire. Above her, Chandler shifted, drawing the back of his left hand up her chest, just the ghost of a touch, and over her shoulder to hold the back of her head. He must have had his whole forearm pressed hard against the mattress, because his thigh pressured between hers with more force and his hips rolled across her abdomen as he settled tighter against the middle of her body, barely holding himself off and letting the mattress swallow them in its cloud-like cushion. Chandler pecked at her lips and tickled the tip of his tongue against the sensitive corner of her mouth. He used his height and weight and damn insistence on taking things slowly to completely overwhelm her, but Monica was quite happy to be passive in his arms. Any other man and Monica probably wouldn't have allowed it, but Chandler didn't feel like he would hurt her if he overpowered her. He was her physical equal in a way no other man had ever been. Stronger than her, yes, but willing to be weak so she could be strong too. He would fight her for dominance, yes, but enjoy the competition and grin at the outcome either way. Her hips swelled in the hopes of kicking things into a higher gear, but Chandler remained with one fist in her hair, one hand at her spine, and his aggravatingly gentle tongue curling fire against her taste buds. He was making her dizzy. Had she even told him she didn't want to make love? Monica couldn't remember. She knew a lot of their relationship was instinctive and wordless, born from understanding each other better than anybody else, and knowing almost everything about each other, having observed each other for years. But Chandler seemed to know what she wanted and what she needed better than Monica did, and then he fulfilled her without question. He traced the underside of her tongue with the tip of his and caressed her lips with his. His fingers tapped against her back, over her shoulder, and pinched the strap of her singlet. Monica groaned impatiently as she felt Chandler's knuckles brush along her collarbone as he toyed with the spaghetti-thin sleeve. The flat of it, the flat of his fingernails the flat of his fingernails massaged deeply into the side of her sore breast, just beneath her armpit, and her whole body convulsed. Monica had known her chest was tight and tender, and that typically curling into a ball with her knees, pushing them hard, worked wonders at reducing the ache, but she hadn't realized lying flat under Chandler's weight would achieve the same end, or that his calculated massage of the knot just beneath her armpit would make her hips tip upwards. Her senses went into overdrive, too many things desperately requiring her attention, as Chandler's pace didn't change, but his intensity, the force he applied to her body, grew. His tongue flicked against the roof of her mouth, and his hips pressed against hers, his thigh pushing against where her thighs had fallen open in the hopes his other leg would join it. And then his thumb slipped under her cotton shirt. He ground down on her pebbled nipple as he pressed his tongue against the back of her throat. Then he painted matching circles, feather-light and clockwise, before flicking the side of his nail against her and scratching downwards deliciously. Monica exhaled shakily, completely at his mercy. Then Chandler did it again. His knuckles massaged her harder, his thumb rubbing harder, scratching lighter, his mouth sucking and pressing, too many sensations at once. And Monica shivered violently. Her body arched upwards, and a moan reverberated in her throat, deeper than usual, her body vibrating with energy before slumping against the mattress. Did you just... Chandler blinked at her in disbelief. Monica wasn't sure what that had been, as if it was just a wanton shiver and her insides snapping with heightened desire or something sublime and fervid. It definitely wasn't her strongest orgasm, if that's what it even was, but it certainly felt wonderful. She didn't know if it was caused by her body's state, what had something to do with there being more blood than normal was gathered at her core, making her more sensitive. That was definitely what was making her horny. She read enough magazines to know that. But Monica definitely hadn't thought she'd even been able to orgasm despite how much she might have wanted to, especially because of how undesirable her period had made her feel in the past, with headaches and stomach cramps and the unsexy night pad she wore. Or maybe it had nothing to do with her, but with the man above her. But was the man above her, knowing instinctively which button to press to result in the reactions he wanted? Whatever the cause, Monica had never felt that sort of rush of pleasure with all her clothes still on. She didn't answer or try to explain, her mind hazy, her breath shuddering out of her chest and pleasure tingling through her body, her lower abdomen tightening hopefully. She didn't want to analyze the how and why and what of whatever had just occurred, although she certainly would at some later date see if they could recapture it. Still, she definitely felt the need to affirm Chandler's suspicions, or thank him, or have him do it again. She definitely wanted it again. Monica bit her lips together, trying to rub some feeling back into them as she tried to calm her humming body and decide what to say. "I thought you were going to tuck me into bed," she teased. Unfairly, Chandler acted as though he was unfazed one way or the other, all the surprise and desire disappearing from his eyes, the hard outline of his body lifting off of her. His smirk was the only thing revealing his mood as he shifted sideways and pushed upwards, shifting away from her, the twist of his lips showing that he was teasing her. "Don't push your luck, I still might." She laughed. She'd felt him, could feel him against her even though he was trying not to touch her. But even though Monica knew Chandler was teasing, the threat that he might actually slow down or worse, stop, scared her. Her body chilled even though Chandler was still in arm's reach, only a deep breath between them. That wasn't acceptable as far as Monica was concerned. She pushed him away from her, and he squeaked in protest as he rose to his knees. Monica's hands never left Chandler's shoulders, and she gripped him tightly so she could pull herself up with him. She crawled up to recapture his lips with hers, and then Monica hitched her leg over his and straddled Chandler's lap without breaking their kiss. She was so glad she was only wearing a pair of old leggings, because the fabric was thin as it stretched over her parted thighs when Chandler's hands drifted down to hold them. She could feel every keyboard callus on his palms and pencil grip bump on his fingers. She held his jaw in her hands to hold his mouth to hers and pulled herself as high as she could on his thighs, feeling the shape of his. I don't. Okay, there's no safe way to say this on YouTube. Feeling the shape of his erection at her core. Monica wanted none of the delicacy Chandler had shown her earlier, and proved it by shoving her tongue into his mouth. She let her hands drift down Chandler's chest and leaned back just enough to work her hands beneath his shirt. Greedily, Monica pushed her hands up Chandler's stomach, briefly stopping to trace over his ribs and thread through the downy hair that grew around his nipples, while her wrists collected his shirt before she ripped it off him. She yanked him back to her after Chandler released his hold on her to get his arms free of his clothes, squeezing him tightly to her chest, with her fingers digging into the meat of his back, working lower and lower to crush him against her. Monica liked this angle too, being taller than him, but only slightly. She moved one hand for the base of his spine to pull at his hair, so he dropped his head backwards and she could kiss him hungrily. Chandler groaned. His hands fell to her hips, running hot lines of want down to her knees and back up the tips of her thighs, before circling her legs and massaging the same desire down the sides and backs of her legs. He sucked her tongue into his mouth, coaxing more from her with every tug of his lips and squeeze of his fingers. Chandler's hands guided Monica to sway gently across his lap, and they both groaned as they found the perfect rhythm. They'd gotten very good at wordless gasps and grunts and groans, and on the few occasions they were completely alone, the pair of them had pounded against each other with a different level of aggression and overpowering lust, competing as to who could draw out the loudest screams and shouts from the other, but the quiet-mouthed moans were just as salacious. And not just because they knew they had to be quiet and they were trying to make it as difficult as possible, or the fear of getting caught spurring them on. It was Chandler, whispering her name in awe reverently as he whipped her singlet across the room, in his desperation to get as far away from her skin as possible. And the way his tongue would curl around his mouth as he cursed Monica when their lips met again. With her bare chest trapped against his, Monica ground down on Chandler's lap, reveling in the sensation of his racing heart pumping against hers, and the way he gasped and dropped his forehead to her shoulder. His hot breath fanned across her chest, and Monica leaned backwards to give Chandler some room, arching her back to offer her breast to his mouth. She tangled her fingers in his hair and repositioned her legs, so that her feet rested on the mattress, maybe even his pillows, and she had a little more leverage to rub herself against him. Meanwhile, Chandler peppered kisses from her shoulder to her chest, and Monica wondered briefly if he was kissing each of her freckles individually, before he opened his hot mouth over the top of her breast and sucked a hard circle into her skin. She shuddered against him, digging her heels into the mattress for some stability. Chandler changed, locked, and laved his way around her sensitive nub, swirling his tongue across her sternum and in the sweat gathering beneath her breast before he drew her nipple between his teeth. Chandler's hands gripped her rear, helping her to keep rocking against him, and Monica crossed her ankles at his back to bring him tighter to her in all the places that mattered, and leaned further backwards as she arched over his forearms. He panted against her skin, pushing her up her back with one hand and moving the other to knead her other breast, fire coursing through her veins because of it. Briefly, Monica worried about Chandler making a mess of his boxers and how unfair it was that she wasn't reciprocating anything, but Chandler hadn't complained. He didn't seem like he was going to stop and demand something from her like another man would have. In fact, he was pumping his hips in tandem with her, meeting her thrust for thrust despite their clothed bottom halves. Besides, laundry might be a good excuse to get some more alone time together. And then he attached his mouth to her other breast, leaving her nipple cold and hard until his thumb dragged his saliva across her, rolling and pinching like his mouth had been moments before, and all thoughts vacated her mind, replaced with a stream of praise for his touch that she wasn't sure of if she said aloud or not. The angle of their gyrating hips perfectly rubbed through her clothes, the shape of him dulled by the barrier, but still meeting her exactly where she needed him, except Monica needed more. More, more. Chandler acquiesced to her request, sliding his hands down her body to push her hips roughly against him. But it wasn't enough. Her whole body felt like a dam on the precipice of overflowing, an innocent prisoner begging for release. She was overcharged like she was buzzing with electricity, without an outlet for all that pent-up energy. She needed him to ram harder against her, to fill her until she spilled over. She gripped his shoulders and pulled herself up against him, anchoring herself down to meet him harder. Chandler's left hand pushed her lower back, aiding his rolling hips, while his right hand traced up her spine, fingers threading through her hair at the back of her scalp. His lips met hers aggressively as he pulled her down to meet his mouth. Holding the back of her neck warmly, Chandler rolled them over and lay her head against his pillow. Gravity added just the right amount of pressure to Chandler's rocking hips, but Monica squeezed her thighs around him anyway, her feet pushing him against her. Monica pushed her hips upwards, and let her hips fall to his own hips, gripping the waistband of her leggings. The slow grind wasn't enough anymore, and the harsh rocking was bordering on cruel. Monica wanted more. Mon, he kissed her languidly, stroking his nimble fingers down her sides to grip his wrist. He moved slightly, his tented boxers poking insistently into her soft inner thigh. We don't have to do this. His kiss She returned his kiss with fervor to let him know she was completely in favor of sharing this with him, and absolutely adoring that he cared enough about her to question her, that he wasn't freaking out or afraid, that he was as flushed. His chest was slick with sweat, his eyes keenly interested in the moonlight, little more than pools of desire rimmed with a blue halo, devilishly handsome and angelically sweet. She also laughed that even filled with lust for her, he could present such reverence and respect for her, waiting for her go-ahead. Monica intertwined her fingers with Chandler's and smiled up at him, flattening his hands against her hips and hooking his thumbs in her pants. Yes, she locked her eyes with his and shivered at what he saw. at what she saw. Had any man ever looked at her like that before? She didn't think so, and Monica was glad that she could show herself with him, just so she could see that softness in his eyes when he looked at her in awe. We do. Okay, that was a long one. That was like a really long one shot. I'm pretty sure it was like around 8,000 words, maybe a little more. Anyway, I that was fun and I love each and every one of you guys. Please don't forget to always be yourselves. You are valid, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye.